A barrel of crude oil traded for $210 in Singapore last week. In Sri Lanka, it traded for $286. Those are not forecast numbers. Those are not worst-case projections. Those are actual physical trades, documented by Bloomberg. For actual barrels of oil changing hands in actual markets, where the supply has already run out. In the United States, oil is still trading around $95 to $100 because American domestic production has buffered the shock. Because the Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been tapped. And because a 60-day Jones Act waiver is allowing foreign vessels to move fuel between American ports. But those buffers are temporary. Every barrel released from the SPR is a barrel that does not exist for the next emergency. Every Jones Act waiver has an expiration date, and every barrel of domestic production that the U.S. exports instead of keeping, which is currently running at nearly 12.9 million barrels per day of crude and petroleum products combined, is a barrel that leaves the country while American gasoline and distillate inventories remain below their 5-year average. JPMorgan has warned that inventories are reaching the minimum operational level. The U.S. Energy Information Administration forecasts retail gasoline prices peaking at a monthly average of $4.30 per gallon in April, with diesel peaking at over $5.80 per gallon in the same month. But those forecasts assume that oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz resume later in 2026. The strait has been effectively closed since March 4th. The ceasefire announced on April 8th collapsed within 24 hours. The Islamabad talks failed on April 12th. The strait is still blocked. And if the disruption extends into summer, when American driving demand surges by 500 to 700 barrels per day above winter levels, the inventory buffers that are keeping gas at $4 instead of $6 or $7 will be gone. Not declining, gone. And once the physical fuel runs out, no price mechanism can bring it back. You cannot buy what does not exist. And the EIA confirmed in their April outlook that the Brent WTI spread widened to an average of $12 per barrel in March, compared with $6 in February, and is forecast to peak at $15 per barrel in April when production disruptions are largest. That spread is the market telling you in real time that international oil is becoming dramatically more expensive relative to American oil, which means the economic incentive to export American fuel offshore is growing every day. Every barrel of American gasoline or diesel that gets shipped to a European or Asian buyer willing to pay a $15 per barrel premium is a barrel that is not available at your local gas station. And the market does not care whether you need that barrel to drive to work. The market sends the barrel wherever the price is highest. And right now, the price is highest everywhere except the United States, which means the buffers that are keeping American gas prices at $4 instead of $7 are being actively eroded by the very market mechanism that is supposed to allocate supply efficiently. The efficient allocation of supply in a global oil crisis means America's fuel goes to whoever pays more. And right now, that is not you. Oil prices have surged 80% and nobody in America has grasped what happens next. Economics Help published an analysis 2 days ago with a headline that should have stopped every American in their tracks. Oil prices have soared 80%, yet outwardly markets appear relatively calm. But under the surface, a serious crisis is brewing. Their analysis drew a direct comparison to the early days of COVID, where everything was fine until it suddenly was not. The trading price of oil does not fully reflect what is coming in the next months. They wrote, because old inventories are keeping the economy afloat as a short-term stopgap. But inventories are running down fast. And as inventories and oil at sea run out, the actual shortage could double from 4 million barrels per day to up to 8 million barrels per day. That is the point where the crisis becomes catastrophic. U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts, including teams at Goldman Sachs and JPMorgan, are now openly modeling the possibility that oil prices could surge to an unprecedented $200 per barrel. At $200 per barrel, gasoline at the pump reaches $7 to $8 per gallon nationally. Diesel reaches $9 to $10. Jet fuel prices force airlines to cancel routes entirely. Spirit Airlines already ceased all operations on May 2nd, citing rising fuel costs. That is a canary in the coal mine that nobody is treating as the warning it is. An American airline went bankrupt because of fuel costs. Not because of management failures, not because of debt. Because the fuel to fly the planes became too expensive to justify operating. And Spirit will not be the last. At $200 per barrel, the American economy enters territory it has never experienced. No economic model can offset $8 gasoline in a country where 85% of workers commute by car, where the average commute is 27 miles each way, where public transit serves less than 5% of workers, and where 70 years of suburban development was built on the assumption that gasoline would remain affordable forever. At $8 per gallon, the average commuter spending $200 per month today would spend $400 to $500. That additional $300 per month gets extracted from grocery budgets already stretched, from healthcare already being skipped, from savings already approaching zero, or from the credit card already at record delinquency. Or it comes from driving less, which means not getting to the job that pays the bills. The circular trap closes hardest on rural Americans, older Americans, and working-class Americans who have no public transit alternative, no remote work option, and no cushion to absorb a doubling of transportation costs. The fundamental issue is that the Strait of Hormuz is not just partially disrupted. It is effectively closed. 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade transited the strait in 2025. That traffic has been reduced by more than 90%. Approximately 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships are stranded in the Persian Gulf. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber confirmed that 230 loaded oil tankers are waiting inside the Gulf with nowhere to go. And approximately 3 million barrels per day of refining capacity in the Gulf region has been shut down due to attacks and a lack of viable export outlets. These are refineries that were producing gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel for global markets. They are not producing anymore. And the products they were making have to come from somewhere else, which means refineries outside the region are being asked to increase output. But many are actually curtailing refinery runs due to concerns about whether they can get enough crude oil feedstock to keep running at current capacity. Summer driving season begins in 4 weeks, and American fuel inventories are already below the 5-year average. Memorial Day weekend. The unofficial start of summer driving season is approximately 4 weeks away. Between Memorial Day and Labor Day, American gasoline consumption typically increases by 500, 0 to 700. 0 barrels per day as families take road trips, commuters increase driving, and the economy generally accelerates seasonal activity. That seasonal surge is built into the EIA's forecast models every year. What is not built into any forecast model is a seasonal demand surge, arriving on top of the worst oil supply disruption in history. The EIA's April short-term energy outlook confirmed that U.S. gasoline and distillate inventories remain below the 5-year average. Not slightly below, materially below. At a time when they should be building ahead of summer. They are drawing down because the global supply disruption is pulling American fuel into export markets where prices are higher. U.S. exports of crude and petroleum products rose to nearly 12.9 million barrels per day in April 2026. America is exporting fuel at the fastest pace on record, while its own inventories are below average heading into the highest demand quarter of the year. And the EIA forecast assumes that Strait of Hormuz disruptions begin to dissipate in Q3 and Q4 2026. If they do not, the agency's own numbers show a gasoline supply gap that cannot be filled by any combination of domestic production increases, SPR releases, or refinery utilization improvements. No new refinery has been built in the United States since 1977. Existing refineries are running at approximately 90% utilization, which is near maximum practical capacity. There is no spare refining capacity to convert additional crude oil into gasoline, even if additional crude were available. The bottleneck is physical. The equipment to turn crude oil into the fuel your car runs on does not exist in sufficient quantity. And building it would take 5 to 7 years even if construction started tomorrow. The EIA's most optimistic gasoline price forecast for 2026 is $3.70 per gallon as an annual average, which is already 20% higher than 2025. But that average masks the summer peak. which they project at $4.30 per gallon in April, with the potential for significantly higher prices in June, July, and August if the strait remains closed and summer demand materializes as expected. And that $4.30 projection was published before the ceasefire collapsed, before the Islamabad talks failed, and before Trump declared the naval blockade. The actual number could be significantly higher. Diesel is more dangerous than gasoline, and European shortages are already spreading toward America. Bloomberg reported that traders, executives, and advisors are warning that fuel crunches hitting Asia will soon start spreading west, and that Europe is likely to face surging prices and is at risk of diesel shortages in the coming weeks. Shell had issued a warning that Europe could face a shortage of fuel as early as April. European airlines have already started canceling flights because of jet fuel scarcity. Chemical and steel manufacturers across the EU and UK have imposed surcharges of up to 30% to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. Some diesel benchmark prices in Asia have more than doubled. And when Europe faces diesel shortages, the pressure shifts immediately to the United States because global refined product markets are interconnected. American refineries, which produce approximately 5 million barrels of diesel per day, become the supplier of last resort for European buyers willing to pay premium prices, which means American diesel gets pulled offshore to serve European demand at the exact moment American truckers, farmers, and construction companies need it for domestic use. Every semi-truck on the American interstate runs on diesel. Every combine in the grain belt runs on diesel. Every piece of heavy construction equipment runs on diesel. When diesel becomes scarce, the food supply chain seizes because the trucks that move food from processing plants to distribution centers to grocery stores cannot run without it. The grocery store has approximately 72 hours of inventory on the shelf at any given time. 3 days, that is the buffer between a functioning food system and visible shortages. And the 2022 diesel crunch, which was caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, pushed U.S. distillate inventories to a 70-year low. The current crisis is being described by the IEA as worse than anything since 1973. If diesel inventories approach the 2022 lows during the summer of 2026, while the Hormuz Strait remains effectively closed and European buyers are competing for every available cargo, the result will not be higher prices at the pump. It will be stations with bags over the nozzles and signs that say no diesel. And the food prices that follow a diesel shortage are not 5 or 10% increases. They are 20 to 30% spikes that arrive within weeks because the transportation cost is embedded in every product at every step. Fertilizer shortages from Hormuz are already threatening American corn and the food chain that depends on it. Over 30% of global urea, which is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer and is produced from natural gas, is exported from Gulf countries through the Strait of Hormuz. That supply has been disrupted since March 4th. The LNG disruption is not just an energy story. It is a fertilizer story, and a fertilizer story is a food story. And a food story in the United States is specifically a corn story. Because corn is the foundational crop of the American food system. Corn feeds the cattle that become beef. Corn feeds the chickens that become poultry and eggs. Corn feeds the dairy herds that produce milk and cheese. Corn is processed into high-fructose corn syrup, ethanol, cornstarch, corn oil, and hundreds of food additives that appear in processed foods across every aisle of the grocery store. The price shock and the shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce the planting and yields of corn in the United States, which would potentially increase global food prices into 2027, according to analysis of the Hormuz crisis. Unlike oil, the fertilizer sector does not have internationally coordinated strategic reserves. There is no fertilizer equivalent of the SPR. When fertilizer supply is disrupted, there is no emergency stockpile to release. Prices simply rise until demand is destroyed, which means farmers plant less, use less fertilizer per acre, accept lower yields, or switch to crops that require less nitrogen input. Every one of those responses reduces the total food output of the American agricultural system. Global fertilizer prices are estimated to average 15 to 20% higher during the first half of 2026 if the crisis continues. And that increase will not remain in the fertilizer market. It will propagate through feed costs, through livestock production costs, through processing and packaging costs, and ultimately through the retail price of beef, poultry, dairy, eggs, bread, cereal, and every processed food product that contains a corn derivative. The IEA confirmed on April 14th that the Ras Laffan LNG facility in Qatar, the largest liquefaction facility in the world, has been offline since it was first attacked on March 2nd and is estimated to require 3 to 5 years to fully repair. That facility was not just producing energy. It was producing the feedstock for the fertilizer that grows the food that feeds the livestock that Americans eat every day. 3 to 5 years to repair. The damage to the American food system from this single facility being destroyed will be measured in higher prices at the grocery store for years, not months. And the fertilizer crisis is compounding on top of a food system that was already under severe stress. Bird flu has resulted in the culling of over 185 million birds since 2022. The cattle herd is at a 75-year low. Farm bankruptcies have been climbing for 3 consecutive years. Farm labor has been disrupted by immigration enforcement. And the tariffs that were imposed in 2025 increased input costs for American farmers by raising the price of imported equipment, chemicals, and parts. The fertilizer shortage from Hormuz is the latest shock to a food production system that has been absorbing hits from every direction for 3 years. And unlike the energy system, where the United States has domestic production capacity to buffer the initial impact, the food system has no equivalent buffer. There is no strategic food reserve. There is no emergency stockpile of corn, wheat, or soybeans. The grain bins that hold the harvest are owned by private companies and farmers, not by the government. And the 72-hour grocery store inventory window means that any disruption to the production, processing, or transportation of food shows up on the shelf within days, not weeks. The summer of 2026 is shaping up to be the most dangerous intersection of energy disruption and food disruption in American history since World War II. And unlike World War II, there is no rationing system in place. No victory garden campaigns. No federal infrastructure for managing civilian food scarcity. The system is designed for abundance. It has no plan for shortage. Panic buying has already started in 14 countries, and history says America is 6 to 8 weeks behind. India experienced unfounded panic about shortages that led to people forming long queues for petrol. Myanmar restricted private vehicle use to alternate days. Nepal announced it would refill only half of consumers' empty cylinders to lengthen stockpiles. The Philippines has experienced an ongoing energy crisis since February. Pakistan requested emergency rerouting of Saudi oil shipments through alternate ports. European airlines canceled flights. Singapore marine fuel buyers are purchasing only the absolute minimum, because scarcity is so severe that sellers do not want to offload large volumes in case they run out of barrels to honor forward commitments. These are not theoretical risks. These are events that have already happened in the past 6 weeks in countries across Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The United States has been buffered so far by 3 factors. Domestic production, which is the highest in the world at 13.6 million barrels per day. Geographic distance from the Strait, which gives American refineries access to Western Hemisphere crude from Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and Guyana that does not transit Hormuz, and the SPR release and Jones Act waiver that have temporarily increased the available supply inside the country. But all 3 buffers have limits. Domestic production is forecast to decline in 2026 and 2027 according to the EIA. The SPR is at its lowest level since 1984, and is scheduled to fall further to 238 million barrels by 2028. The Jones Act waiver expires after 60 days, and the Western Hemisphere crude sources that American refineries depend on cannot replace the volume that normally transits Hormuz because they produce different grades and are already committed to existing contracts. When the buffers expire and the physical shortage arrives in the United States, the behavior that has already been documented in 14 countries will appear in America. It will appear at gas stations in the form of lines, purchase limits, and dry pumps. It will appear in diesel markets in the form of trucking companies reducing routes, construction projects halting, and agricultural operations scaling back. And it will appear in the grocery store in the form of price spikes. reduced selection, and empty shelf sections that remind Americans over 50 of something they have not seen since the 1970s. Bloomberg reported that more than 3 dozen industry insiders repeated one message over the past week. The world still has not grasped the severity of the situation. Many drew parallels with the 1970s oil shock and warned that a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would threaten an even bigger crisis. The 1970s oil shock caused a 40% decline in the stock market, double-digit inflation, gasoline rationing, recession, and a fundamental restructuring of the American economy. The IEA's director says the current crisis is more serious than 1973. And 1973 did not involve the physical destruction of the world's largest LNG facility. The damage this time is structural in a way that the 1973 embargo was not. Because the 1973 embargo was a political decision that could be reversed by a political decision. The destruction of Ras Laffan requires 3 to 5 years of physical reconstruction. There is no political negotiation that can restore a facility that has been bombed. The supply that facility provided is gone for years. And the downstream effects on fertilizer, on food, on heating, on electricity generation, and on every American household that depends on natural gas for any purpose will compound every month that the facility remains offline. And here is what nobody on the evening news is telling you about what happens when the summer demand surge hits the depleted inventory base. In a normal year, refineries spend the spring building gasoline inventory ahead of summer. They run at maximum rates, they stockpile. They position barrels in regional storage terminals along the Colonial Pipeline, through the Midwest PADD2 system, and along the West Coast distribution network. That buildup is happening this year against the backdrop of a global oil market that has lost 20% of its seaborne trade, a refining sector that has lost 3 million barrels per day of Gulf capacity, an LNG market that has lost its largest facility for 3 to 5 years, and an American export sector that is shipping product offshore at record rates to capture the premium in international markets. The buildup cannot keep pace with the drawdown. And when the summer demand hits in June, the system will not have the cushion it normally has. The first sign will be regional price spikes in markets that are furthest from refineries, or that depend on a single pipeline for supply. The Southeast, which depends almost entirely on the Colonial Pipeline for refined products from the Gulf Coast, is the most vulnerable region. If a refinery goes offline for unplanned maintenance during the summer, as regularly happens, there is no backup supply to fill the gap. The price spike will be immediate, the shortage will be physical, and the panic buying that follows will accelerate the drawdown in a self-reinforcing cycle, where the fear of running out causes the running out. That is exactly what happened during the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack in May 2021. The pipeline was down for 6 days. Stations from Virginia to Florida ran dry within 48 hours. Not because the fuel had run out nationally, because panic buying emptied every station in the region faster than the distribution system could resupply. Now imagine that scenario in a summer where the global oil supply is disrupted by the worst energy crisis in history, where inventories are already below average, where diesel is being competed for by European buyers, where refineries are running at capacity with no room to surge, and where the SPR has already been tapped and is at a 40-year low. That is the scenario the EIA is modeling. That is the scenario that Bloomberg sources are warning about. That is the scenario that the IEA director called the greatest energy security challenge in history. And that is the scenario that most Americans will not understand until they pull into a gas station in July and see a bag over the pump handle. Fill your tank today, because the 1973 oil embargo lasted 5 months and restructured the American economy for a generation. The current crisis has lasted 6 weeks, and the infrastructure damage is worse. The strategic reserves are lower, the refining capacity is tighter. The geopolitical situation is more volatile. And the American consumer is more financially fragile than at any point in the past 50 years. If this crisis extends through the summer, which every indicator currently suggests it will, the America that emerges on the other side will not be the same America that entered it. The era of cheap abundance, always available fuel that defined the second half of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st is being tested right now by the worst supply disruption in history. And the test is happening during the highest demand quarter of the year. In a country with no spare refining capacity, no fully stocked strategic reserve, no plan for managing civilian fuel scarcity, and no political consensus on how to respond. By August, you may not be able to fill your tank. And by then, the decisions that would have protected you will already be in the past.